everybody. You're right on time for another ride on the Groove Line with your host, Chris Stevens. Hopefully, your Monday is off to a really good start. Today, we are honoring the 80th birthday. It's his heavenly birthday, but 80 years ago today, January 12th, 1946, the legendary George Duke was born, one of the great jazz fusion artists, keyboardists, producers, singers, songwriters of all time. And I just feel like this dude never really got his proper due while he was here. He passed away from leukemia in August of 2013, so he's been gone a while. But George Duke's musical footprint is pretty much everywhere. Even in the jazz realm, the R&B realm, even hip hop to a degree, because he did an updated version of the Soul Train theme song that a lot of kids of my generation grew up watching before we went out to play on Saturdays or whatever. But yeah, George Duke was a very special musician, and his contributions to the art form, especially black music, should not be forgotten. So today, we are counting down 10 of them things. Yes, 10 George Duke songs that you should know. Now, if we're talking about his production work, I'm probably going to do an entirely different episode on that, probably a little later on down the line this year. That might be one of my Black Music Month 30 series things, just the stuff that George Duke produced for others. But we're talking about the stuff that George Duke did for himself today. So let's get to it. Number 10 is Funny Funk. It is the lead song from his 1974 album Feel, and this was the first time that George really started working with different sort of synthesizers. He was already a master keyboarder, working with Jean-Luc Ponty and Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention and different folks like that. But he really started to get into the electronic side of things with Feel, and Funny Funk is one of those songs that just sort of gives you an idea of where George Duke's sound is going to go post 1974. Like, if you didn't listen to the early George Duke stuff, it's pretty jazzy, as jazz musicians do. But when you talk 1974, you got to think about it this way. Herbie Hancock has just dropped a bomb the previous year with Headhunters. Roy Ayers is starting to, really, funk it up a little bit, with, change in the game album. So, jazz musicians really had to start thinking differently. And granted, you could probably say Miles started this whole thing with On the Corner, Bitches Brew, and so on and so forth. But, everybody else just sort of kind of got into that vein, and George was no different. And Funny Funk is a really, really fun, electronic, funky masterpiece that you probably need to listen to if you haven't already, if you want to learn more about George Duke. Number 9 is from 1982's Dream On album, and the song is called Shine On. And of course, once again, form follows function. You got to remember, in 82, there was a lot of artists that went a different way with respect to their sound, because post-disco is one of the most, I always say it on this channel, this is a post-disco R&B stan account. I love that early 80s, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84-ish kind of sound, where artists and musicians and producers were trying to figure out, okay, well, now we've been working with synthesizers. Now we have these drum machines. We got the Lin, we got the Roland TR 808, we got a couple of the 909. There are a couple other beatboxes out there at that point in time. So now these R&B artists, these jazz artists, they're trying to figure out, how can we stay relevant in this new technological era? And George Duke was no different. I mean, granted, he had already done it, as I mentioned, with, synthesized keyboards and things, but Shine On definitely sounds like a fun electro record. And that's probably the last thing George would describe it as. But if you like, just vibing in the car, going for a ride, or you just going for a walk, Shine On is a great song for that. Absolutely a great song for that. Number 8 is Corinne. It is an instrumental track from his 1979 album, Follow the Rainbow. And George's wife, Corinne, figured prominently into the themes of his art. In fact, the last album he ever did before he passed, Dreamweaver, was a dedication to Corinne, who had passed before him. So this is another one of those free-flowing, sweet, breezy instrumental pieces that, you can just vibe with your romantic partner with on a cool summer night. Well, there's no such thing as a cool summer night. A comfortable summer night, we'll say. A comfortable summer night is just you and your honey chilling, doing whatever. And Corinne is a perfect, soundtrack for that. And George, he really loved his wife. I mean, again, he dedicated an entire album to her after her passing, which of course was the last album he did. So maybe It was like that whole thing when Malice said about, his own parents on The Birds Don't Sing. Chivalry wasn't dead. He didn't let her go alone. So, you know, just think about, the bond that George Duke and his wife had when you listen to Corinne. And we'll talk more about bonds and love songs a little later on in this countdown. Another album from 1979. Gee, man, these jazz musicians put out albums like candy. 1979, another album that George Duke did was Master of the Game. And this one was a little more funkier. This song is called I Want You for Myself. It is featuring a vocalist by the name of Lynn Davis. And it's not the same I Want You for Myself that George Howard did later on in the 80s and 90s. That is one of my favorite jazz saxophonist pieces ever. But yes, this version of I Want You for Myself is basically a dance floor song about, two people just trying to, keep each other close as they get busy on the dance floor. So when you study your art, you're going to be good at it if you really focus your intention on it. And George, he got a degree from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, I believe it's called, and he had a master's from San Francisco State because, of course, he grew up in the Bay Area. He was from San Rafael, which is in Marin County, which is like basically a few minutes outside of San Francisco. But George, when you're a master musician, you can learn to master different things. And that's probably why he called it Master of the Game, because he had figured all this stuff out by now. And I Want You for Myself is just another one of those fun records that illustrates that perfectly. And speaking of which, we get to 1980 now, and Brazilian Love Affair, the kind of sort of title track of A Brazilian Love Affair. And this is an interesting album from the space of George Duke going to Brazil to do Brazilian jazz music. It's so funny because people really didn't start getting into Brazilian jazz until Quincy Jones's interview, shall we say. But Brazilian jazz and black jazz are closely married together. And it's so interesting because when you think about the transatlantic slave trade in the 1500s and the 1600s, a lot of those Africans did not make it to what was now called America. Some of them, were left in the Caribbean, which is why you have, black islands like Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, even a black population in Puerto Rico and Cuba. But South America was also where a lot of, Africans were dropped off too in the slave trade. That's why Brazil has a very heavy African population. So it's just fitting that an album from a black jazz artist from Northern California meets with Brazilian artists, and George employed a who's who of Brazilian jazz professionals on this album. And the title track is it gives you an idea of what is coming on this record. Like this is going to be a whole lot of samba, a whole lot of shaking going on. It's a fun record. I highly recommend you check out the entire thing. But the song itself is a good intro to that album. Number 5, now this is a personal favorite. I ain't gonna lie to you. People are probably wondering, where the hell is this from? Well, this is from George's 1995 album titled Illusions, and it is called The Simple Things. The Simple Things, simply put, is one of the sweetest ballads without lyrics that I've ever heard. Well, I mean, there are lyrics. It's just not, a full-on, fleshed out 3 verses and a bridge love song. It's an instrumental piece, but it has vocals in it. And you get the feeling that this is just George sort of reflecting on his marriage, on his relationships, and having people reflect on their relationships. Because it goes, my love, the simple things in life will buy us time as time goes by. And then there's this, nice little bridge part, because I love you still, and I always will. Love you. Like, if you have not heard this song, it will definitely lighten your mood if you have a romantic heart. And it's some of George's best keyboard work, because he's just like, free flowing on that thing. He has one of my favorite bass lines of any romantic song ever. I don't know who's playing bass on Simple Things, but props to you, my friend, because you did that there. But yeah, Simple Things, it's just a very, very sweet song. Highly recommend you check it out. Add it to your Quiet Storm playlist. It's on my summer walking playlist. I probably annoy the entire city when I go for a walk and I play this song. Because I mean, it ain't but a couple songs that ain't a couple words that you sing, but still, I'm singing them with all my heart. And Simple Things is just one of those songs that just resonated with me. It's a Tony Brown Quiet Storm thing for me. From you Philly folks, you remember Tony Brown, God rest his soul, man. It'll be 5 years since he passed next month. But yeah, he used to play this all the time on Old School Thursdays. So Simple Things just got into my spirit somehow, and it's become one of my favorite songs, and it's definitely one of my favorite George Duke songs. Oh yeah, now we get funky. Now we go to 1977 and the title track of the Reach For It album. And George definitely was influenced and inspired by what Bootsy, what George and those guys with the P Funk were doing, because it's very clear that these next two songs, the Reach For It and the next one, were obviously very P Funk inspired. It's so funny to hear, George, in his best Bootsy voice, just talking that trash. Well, not talking trash, you know what I mean, talking his talk. And Reach For It is just a basic song about, reaching for the dance floor, have a good time. And it's very funky, it's very bottom heavy. Byron Miller is playing bass on that. Byron Miller has one of my favorite instrumental pieces of recent years called Soldier of the Groove. I don't know how I found that song. Actually, I do. Spotify. Spotify discovery is good for some things. Just take the AI crap out. But yeah, Byron Miller, a veteran jazz bassist, plays on this. The bottom is very, very heavy. Sheila E is on percussion. That was, her introduction to the world as a whole, working with George. So Reach For It, fun record. And it's probably, one of his best in my opinion. But there is one more funky record that kind of surpasses that. And that is 1978's Dookie Stick from Don't Let Go. And that song to me is probably one of the funniest records of the second half of the 70s. Because George wasn't trying to be funny, I don't think. But he was definitely, everybody in that studio was having a damn good time. We'll put it like that. And it has one of my favorite ad-lib pieces, because the ladies on the chorus are singing, "Play for you. We want your mind to blow." And George says, "You want my mind to blow? Is that all?" So it's just like one of those, innuendo type things that I always mention on here when I talk about songwriting from back in the day. And even though that's an ad lib, my mind, is that all? Like, you only want my mind to blow? And then when you think about, mind, head, you know. I ain't gotta explain this to y'all. We adults here. We're all adults here. But yeah, Dookie Stick is just a fun record. Every time it pops up on one of my playlists when if I'm going for a drive or if I'm going for a walk or something, it just puts an extra pep in my step, and then a little bit of swing in my my driving motion. Can't swing too much because I drive a '99 Chevy Prism and it's a hunk of junk, so I really got to be careful. But yeah, anyway, Dookie Stick is just a fun record that I highly recommend you check out. Number two is late era George Duke. I mean, well, Illusions was late era. That's 95. But this is 1992 from the Snapshot album. And this is one of those songs that you have heard millions of times if you are a Gen X or millennial, whether you wanted to hear it or not. And that is No Rhyme, No Reason. This was another one of those ones that took over Quiet Storm with aplomb. I mean, this is a song about cheating, really. This is a song about cheating. And George, I mean, he's got a who's who of vocal acrobats on this song with him. He's got Jim Gilstrap. He's got Rochelle Farrell, who has just put out her album at this time, and she's singing her behind off. And Phil Perry. Phil Perry's birthday was January 11th. Happy birthday, Mr. Phil Perry. We all know why Phil Perry and George Duke are closely paired together, because the kids have discovered Phil Perry's live performance of Forever at Montreux in 1992. So that's why people of the newer generation know Phil Perry for that. You've probably seen the TikTok by now. I ain't got to tell y'all. But yeah, No Rhyme, No Reason. Very, I don't want to say controversial song. I'll say conflicted, but it's just what George Duke did. He made music that people could relate to. He made music that people could sort of place themselves in these situations and be like, yeah, I've been here before. And it's a tremendous song. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend everything. That's why this countdown exists. Now, I know you're probably thinking, this is a cheesy ass pick for number one. And you're right. You're right. But you can't deny that nobody did Black Yacht Rock better in 1981 than George Duke and Stanley Clarke. Sweet Baby, the lead single from the heavily anticipated Clarke Duke Project 1. And I always find it interesting that a lot of people are surprised by collaboration albums these days, because back in the day, it wasn't nothing for people like in the jazz community, these folks work together all the time. They just never really, put their names on. They didn't put everybody's name front and center. But you can go through the liner notes and stuff and say, oh wow, Mtume played, congas for miles. You can look on a random Herbie Hancock album and see, people like Benny Maupin and Paul Jackson and folks who had their own, Harvey Mason, folks who, would end up making their own albums and stuff. So it's not a surprise that jazz musicians collaborate. I mean, it's just a surprise now that, we got these R&B and hip hop and rap producer collaborations that people are now putting their names on. And I think that's interesting because back in the day, they used to be constrained to labels. That's probably why they didn't do it as freely. But now that we live in kind of like a labelless musical society where people can put out their own art as they choose, it's easier to do these collaboration albums. That's probably why Clark Duke, both of them, Clark Duke Part 1 and Clark Duke Part 2, are probably such sought after collector's items because Stanley Clarke, one of the top jazz bassists ever. And once again, Philly makes this music thing go around. I ain't going to tell y'all no more. Actually, I'm going to tell you every time we on here. Philly makes the world go around, especially from a music perspective. So, Stanley Clarke and George Duke getting together for Sweet Baby. I mean, yeah, it's definitely early 80s, white people sitting at a table, sipping their drinks or whatever, swaying back and forth. I mean, it is what it is, but it's still one of the best songs of the early 80s from a, love song standpoint. Definitely one of the top love songs of 1981. That's a whole year in itself. That's my birth year. I may do a 1981 song every day this year, just for the hell of it. Because Lord willing and the creek don't rise, I'll be 45 September 25th. So might as well celebrate with some music. But yeah, Sweet Baby. That song just speaks for itself. It has spoken for itself for almost 45 years, because it was released in April of 1981. But yeah, just getting those two titans on a song together, playing, their type of music. George on the vocals, Stanley, of course, on bass, George on the keys. You can't beat it. You can't beat it. I want you, sweet baby. Like, that's something that everybody of a certain age knows. And that is something that every artist that does music lives for. You want something that will outlive you. And all of George Duke's music will outlive him. The stuff he did for himself, the stuff he did with others, for others, it all has outlived him, unfortunately. But today we celebrate the 80th anniversary of his birth with just giving you guys some music that, if you didn't know about George Duke, you got 10 songs to choose from and plenty of albums in the meantime to go check them out. So that's what I suggest you do. So if you have not heard of George Duke, go listen to some of this stuff. Come back, let me know what you think in the comments. But if you are a George Duke fan, tell me some of your George Duke favorites. Would love to hear from you. And that's going to do it for this ride on the Groove Line. Greatly appreciate y'all as always. Contact information will be in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you're notified of all the new videos that drop on this channel. And don't forget to like and comment on the videos because, well, I do talk back in the comments. So thank you guys for riding with me on the Groove Line. And until the next time we ride, may you find the groove, or may the groove find you.